All right, thank you everyone for making it to our the 36th Global Prominence Seminar of the Institute of International Affairs of the Graduate School of International Studies at SNU. We are pleased to welcome three distinguished experts that have been working on sustainable development initiatives. So them will be presenting and one will be discussing with me later on. And so without further ado, let's please first welcome Professor Semee Yoon for the congratulatory.
Okay, thank you so much for coming to today's event. My name is Tae Yoon. I'm the professor of the GSIS, Graduate School of International Studies, and also director of Institute of International Affairs. So I'm going to give the Congress remark. So I just write down something for the celebrating today's event. So actually, you might be a little bit surprised the beginning of December, what happened in South Korea. I mean, the political kind of turmoil. But don't worry, we will see the democratic resilience so that you can enjoy the remaining procedure of the political civilization. All right, in that sense, I'm going to give them idea of congratulatory remark. Sorry. So, distinguished guests and esteemed presenters and participants today, it's my great honor and pleasure to extend warm congratulations on the opening of the 36th Global Prominence Seminar, GPS in short. So hosted by the Korea Environment Institute, the KEI, and the IIA, the Institute of International Affairs. The theme of today's seminar, I think, global sustainable economy initiatives, development and prospects, could not be more timely and relevant. So as we navigated through the complexities of climate change and resource scarcity, and also the global inequality, so fostering the sustainable economy is not merely as aspiration, it is kind of the imperative. So we are privileged today to have the outstanding lineup of speakers and experts. So Mr. David O'Connor from International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and Mr. Sheng Fulai, whose insights illuminate the challenges and opportunities we are now facing. So under the expert moderation, Professor Semee Yoon, today, this seminar will promise it to provide invaluable perspectives on building a more sustainable and inclusive global economy. So our institute, the Institute of International Affairs, has long been a beacon of interdisciplinary dialogue and forward thinking initiatives. So this seminar, in that sense, is a testament to its unwavering commitment to shaping a better future. So I'm very confident that the discussion today will not only inspire, but also chart actionable pathway for global cooperation and innovation. So once again, thank you to all who have worked tireless to bring this event to this fruition, and also to all the participants for our dedication to this vital cause. So I wish this seminar every success and look forward to the meaningful outcome we'll be making today. So once again, thank you very much indeed for the very distinguished speaker today, and also the KEI and our institute. So I'll look forward to having very fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Now, we'd like to welcome Dr. Ho-Seok Kim, who's the Chief Research Fellow and the Chair of National Sustainability Research Group at the Korea Environment Institute.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Ho-Seok Kim, Chief Research Fellow at the Korea Environment Institute. Thank you for arranging this seminar on Friday. Thank you, Professor Kim, and thank you, Professor Yoon, for co-hosting this event. Let me briefly explain the background of this seminar. The economics has played a a crucial role in addressing the green issues, and economies are shaping national and global policies. Since the pandemic, green issues have become the top priority at the global and local and national level. And we are having a new green challenges every year, and this calls for advancing and refining the economic theories to remain relevant and meaningful. To address this issue, to address this need, we are developing a new economics textbook that revisits conventional economic theories and explores green issues from a theoretical perspective. And on the other hand, on the policy side, since the 1980s, the United States, UN has introduced concepts like sustainable development and green economy to tackle global challenges and support developing countries. This concept has significantly influenced international corporations and national policy making. But despite their importance, the sustainable development and the green economy are often misunderstood due to their complexity and their diverse applications across policies and projects, so which vary depending on the circumstances of different countries. To provide clarity, I've decided to add 2 chapters in the textbook on sustainable development and green economy, and invited David O'Connor and Sheng Fulai to distinguished experts who directly contributed to developing these concepts. And when planning a meeting in Korea, I suggested Professor Yoon that we organize this session to give students the opportunity to learn directly from these experts. So I hope you find this event insightful, and thank you.
All right, now let's welcome Mr. David O'Connor, who will speak to us about Sustainable Development 2030 Agenda, and he was actually the lead for discussing SDGs at UN. So I'm sure we can hear a lot of insights from him.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah? Can you see me behind this podium? Okay. Let me get out my timer here so I don't exceed time, since Fulai has to speak after me and we want to leave some time for questions and answers and discussion. So give me a second to time myself. Okay. Right. So I'm going to speak today about sustainable development, the concept. Oh, okay, I think I'm better off holding it. Okay, you hear me? Yes. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in which the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded as their centerpiece, as the centerpiece. Let me give you a brief outline of my talk. I will very briefly talk about where the idea of sustainable development comes from and bring it up through the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by the international community in 2015 at the SDG Summit, Sustainable Development Summit in New York. Why the need for global goals in the first place? And I'll talk a little bit about the history of goal setting in the international context and the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, and what the record was with those and why they kind of provided a prototype, a model for developing a new set of goals after 2015, which was the date by which the international community and national governments and others were supposed to have met the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And so the international community decided that we need something to replace them and to build upon them. And I'll get to that in a moment. I'll talk a bit about the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, which was created under the auspices of the UN General Assembly in New York to formulate a proposal for Sustainable Development Goals to be adopted by the General Assembly, the highest legislative body of the world international community, again, in 2015. And then I'll say something about, well, how have we been doing since 2015? Have we been making good progress? The answer to that is not so good in most cases, unfortunately. We had a huge setback, as you all know too well, the pandemic, which contributed to slowing our progress, although progress was already too slow to achieve many of the goals in the time frame set, which is by 2030. So since progress has been insufficient, and we've now gotten out of the pandemic, fortunately, how do we accelerate progress to make up for lost time and to try to get close, at least, to achieving these goals by 2030? What can we learn? And this is what I want to spend most of my time discussing. What can we learn from historical experience with how policy, how governments, this is a international studies policy school, how can policy help to accelerate progress? I mean, progress happens one way or another. Regress happens also, as we know. But in general, we can say that most societies are progressing in one or another dimension over time. But we need to accelerate progress. We can't go at the pace that we have been going if we hope to achieve the goals. And in particular, if we hope to get to grips with the biggest challenge, I guess, we face on the environmental stage at least, which is climate change. We know that there is a limited window of opportunity to try to keep global mean temperature from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, or 2 degrees even. And we're already pretty much blowing by 1.5 degrees and on the way to exceeding 2 degrees. So we're in serious territory, and we need to figure out how do we accelerate in order to keep from crossing these thresholds. And that's what I want to say something about. And what are the historical examples we can draw upon to help us in this regard? Okay. So as a round off, I want to say something about what are the barriers to acceleration? How do we address those barriers in order to enable acceleration towards the goals, and in particular towards tackling climate change, which of course is cross-cutting all the goals, because if we don't get to grips with climate change, we're going to undermine our progress on sustainable development more broadly. It's not the only thing that would undermine that, but it's a pretty important factor. Okay, so let me see how we're doing on time here. Okay. I'm going to run through this very, very quickly. I think you're all students here, so you know this stuff. I don't need to dwell on it. But the origin of the idea of meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs is the essence of the concept of sustainable development that was formulated by Gro Harlem Brundtland and her commission in 1987, I believe it was, Our Common Future. So the notion of intergenerational equity, that we can't just be concerned about the present generation, the people alive today, but we have to entrust to future generations a world that is habitable and they can live in a dignified way. Okay, so after the Brundtland Commission report, the international community decided that there were some big problems that needed to be addressed. Already, the science was becoming pretty clear that climate change was a concern. We didn't yet know how big a concern it was, but it was a concern. And so one of the things that the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 did was to negotiate the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to provide the global legal framework for tackling this, or trying at least to tackle this problem. It also created the Convention on Biological Diversity to address the challenge of the destruction of habitat, the loss of species, and so on. And then it also issued a number of forest principles that were voluntary. They weren't binding principles, but have been extremely useful in guiding policy on forests over the years. And then there was the Rio Declaration, which was a statement of principles on sustainable development, broadly speaking. And I just want to highlight one of those principles. There are quite a few that are important, like polluter pays and the precautionary principle and so on. But the one that has gained a lot of traction in international discussions is common but differentiated responsibilities. And what the name suggests what it means, which is that everyone has to assume responsibility to address global commons problems, to deal with the global environment and conserving the health of the global environment, of the climate system, and so on. Everyone is responsible for that, all countries, all peoples, but we start from very different places. Some countries are very poor, have very limited resources, are mostly victims of climate change and not contributing in any meaningful way to causing it, and others are major contributors to climate change, but have wealth, have technology, and have the means, basically, to help to address that problem, to limit their emissions, to adopt clean energy technologies and clean transport technologies and so on, and to help other countries to do that as well. So that is the essence of the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. I'll just say a brief footnote here because you may find it interesting, some of you. In the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that principle is enshrined, and then it became a mantra in the subsequent negotiations of climate agreements, of protocols, as they're called, which are kind of implementing agreements of the convention. The convention is a framework convention. It doesn't tell you how to do this, right? It just tells this is what we need to do. And so then there were the protocols, the Kyoto Protocol, for example, which was the first agreement under the Framework Convention, which set actually targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions for only those countries who were considered developed at the time, and not for developing countries. Well, that kind of bifurcation may have made sense then, but it definitely doesn't make sense today. And so, as time has gone on, there has been a tug of war, you could say, in international negotiations over how do we define common but differentiated responsibility. It's not you do everything and we do nothing. It can't be that anymore, because there are plenty of developing countries who can afford and ought to be doing something, because as they've developed, they've also become a part of the problem. They are emitting large quantities of greenhouse gases also, and so if we're going to solve the problem, they have to be doing something to help solve it, right? So the notion of common but differentiated has become much more nuanced over time. So what it means is that China's responsibilities are one thing, Burkina Faso's are another. They're not the same, just as China's is not the same as the United States or Korea's, okay? So that's the notion of common but differentiated, as enshrined, for example, in the Paris Agreement, where it's not just developed and developing, it's according to national circumstances, what you are able to do given your level of development, basically, okay? And your contribution to the problem. Okay, so I won't go through all of these other milestones. Fulai will be talking about the green economy and how that emerged in the context of UN negotiations for Rio Plus 20, or even before that, but it informed the negotiations of the Rio Plus 20 conference outcome. And the Rio Plus 20, as the name suggests, was 20 years after Rio, after 1992, this historic event where we had the Framework Convention and the Biodiversity Convention and the Rio Principles and so on. Countries said, okay, look, 20 years have gone by. What have we achieved? Do we need to rethink and maybe come up with something new and better, because we're quite clearly not on the right path. And so there was a conference in Rio, and I was responsible for the negotiations of the outcome in 2012, rather, sorry. And green economy was a theme of that conference, but it was a very contentious one, and maybe Fulai will say a bit about the reasons for that. And so the negotiator at Rio Plus 20 from Colombia, the country Colombia, not the University of Colombia, where I think you studied, she was concerned, as were other people like myself and the ambassadors who were moderating the negotiations, facilitating the negotiations, that if we just have the green economy, we're going to end up with nothing, because there's not going to be agreement on anything significant, anything meaningful, anything substantial on the green economy, because of the divisions, north-south, basically, divisions, developing country divisions. So we have to come up with something new and different that will actually catalyze enthusiasm for this conference and lead to something after the conference, right? And so Paula Caballero, the negotiator for Colombia, came up with the idea, the Colombian government came up with the idea, well, you know, the Millennium Development Goals are supposed to be ending in 2015. This was 2012 now we're talking about, okay. So what's going to come after them? Maybe what we should do is introduce in Rio Plus 20 a proposal to develop a new set of goals which will be called the Sustainable Development Goals, and which will be genuinely sustainable development goals, not just development goals, okay? And so that idea, you think, oh, brilliant idea. Yeah, it was in the end, but at the beginning there was a lot of resistance to it. It took a lot of convincing of countries that it was a good idea. Because, I'll show you in a moment, the poorest countries in particular, many African countries, were reluctant to go beyond the Millennium Development Goals, because many of them hadn't even made enough progress towards the Millennium Development Goals, which were about eradicating poverty, hunger, very basic human development needs. And they would say, why are we going to talk about sustainable development and things like, you know, biodiversity and climate when we have these basic issues we have to continue to work to address? And so there was resistance. But at the end of the day, she convinced these countries and other countries, all countries, that this was a good idea. And that if we didn't address things like climate change, the sustainable part of sustainable development, biodiversity loss, etc., we would never be able to eradicate poverty permanently, eradicate hunger permanently. Because, you know, if we don't address climate change, we're going to have crop failures, we're going to have droughts, we're going to have things which are basically making people poor and hungry again. So what's the point if we're trying to, you know, achieve long-term development? We have to see it as sustainable. And that's the whole notion of sustainable, okay? Okay, so the Open Working Group.
I think you have to change the slides for the presentation too.
Yeah, okay. So I better move on more quickly. Okay, so we had the Open Working Group, we negotiated, and we achieved consensus of 192 countries. Originally we had 70 countries on the Open Working Group. But then that had to be adopted by the General Assembly, so all 193 countries had to agree to these goals and then to incorporate them in what was to be called the 2030 Agenda, which is a framework which includes a vision, but also some discussion of how do we achieve these goals, the means of implementation, the financing, the governance, the other things that need to be in place to achieve them, and how do we follow up? How do we monitor progress, ensure that we're on track, and course correct if we need to, okay? So that's the 2030 Agenda proposal, which went for adoption at the at the Sustainable Development Summit in 2015. And then, 2 months later, or 2.5 months later, you had the Paris Agreement. So these processes were taking place in parallel, because they were negotiating the Paris Agreement while we were negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals. So there was this dynamic back and forth going on between the two sets of negotiations. And it was a very curious dynamic, because there were countries who passionately believed that we needed to do more about climate change, who didn't want to have climate change in the 2030 Agenda, because they were afraid that if we agreed on something in the 2030 Agenda, we would be giving away our bargaining chips for the Paris Agreement. We wanted to keep our cards close to our chest so we could get the best outcome possible in Paris, okay? So it was a very tricky back and forth to decide, should we have a goal on climate change? And at the end of the day, the ambassador of Hungary's daughter, who was in the UN school where my daughter went, the way he describes it, at least, she said to her father, "Daddy, you're negotiating UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you're not going to have a goal on climate change? What are you talking about? That's absolutely crazy." And so at the end of the day, the young people won. and so governments came around to say, yes, we need to have climate change in this agenda. We would look foolish if we didn't, even though we know that the big decisions are going to be made in Paris. Yes, okay, we accept that. So what we will do is we'll have a goal, but we will refer to the Paris negotiations as the main venue for agreeing on how to tackle climate change, and we'll leave the goal 13 of the SDGs fairly vague, but prescriptive, but without a temperature target, for example. So there's no 1.5 or 2 degrees in the SDGs. That comes only in Paris, okay? And that was a big concern, because the small island states, who are most vulnerable to climate change, wanted a 1.5 degree target in the Paris Agreement. But at that time, it was not clear they were going to get it. And so they didn't want that the 2030 Agenda would have a 2 degrees target, but not mention 1.5 degrees. That would undermine their bargaining position. So we had to say, no, we're not going to touch the target. That's for Paris. But we do think climate change is a sustainable development goal, so we're going to include it in the 2030 Agenda. Okay, so these are the goals, as you know. I don't know if any of you can recite them by heart, but probably not. Semee's professor at Columbia, advisor, had his own proposal for the SDGs, I think she knows probably, which was, I think, for 12 goals or something like that, which were the 12 chapters of his book on sustainable development. But he didn't win the day. He thought 17 is too many. Nobody's going to remember 17. Well, yeah, probably not. But it's good to practice your memory skills. But anyway, member states said the world is complicated. We can't reduce everything to 12 just because it's a nice, elegant number, or 10. We have to deal with the realities we're facing, and our realities demand that we have these goals, and they just happen to be 17. They could have been any number, but this is what we want to see. And even then, there were disagreements. So, for example, the United States, they were very, very good. Obama was the president at that time, so it was a slightly different world from the one we're about to enter. But in any case, the United States is never keen on other countries telling it how it should live, right? So we don't want you telling us about our consumption and production patterns and how they affect the climate or whatever. That's our business, not yours. So we don't want a goal on sustainable consumption and production. Inequalities, we're not too comfortable with that either, because we know we have a lot of inequality in the United States, but it's not your business, it's our business, okay? So those were some of the concerns, but other countries pushed back, okay? And in particular, the developing countries said, hey, look, you know, a lot of these goals are directed at our needs, but they also require that you do something, because you're contributing to the problem through your consumption and production patterns. And if you don't address your consumption and production patterns, we can't deal with our problems, because we're going to have climate change. We're going to have things undermining our own development. On inequalities, there was a slightly different dynamic where Brazil, who was hosting, who hosted the Rio Plus 20 conference, of course, and had an outsized role in the negotiations, said, look, inequalities are important between countries. We want to close the gap between the low-income countries. That's what development is about, convergence of incomes towards the rich countries' levels of income. Korea's done it. Korea is almost as rich as the United States these days, right? How did that happen? Through development, right? And other countries want to do the same thing. Brazil and China, of course, is doing it. But Brazil also had a very successful case internally, where inequalities within Brazil, which are wider than they are even in the United States, had been reduced significantly through a major initiative under the previous Lula da Silva administration, the Bolsa Familia, basically providing cash transfers to poor families to ensure their kids went to school and got health care and vaccinations and so on. And so Brazil wanted to showcase this as how you address inequalities. And so at the end of the day, that was the bargain, okay? Developed countries want to have something on governance, on how countries should govern themselves, democracy and human rights and participatory governance. Fair enough, that's all good stuff, and it helps. But developing countries said, if you want us to agree to that, then you agree to this, and then we'll come to a shared agenda. So that's how negotiations work, and that's how it turned out in this case as well. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to close soon because I'm running over time. Okay, let me try to accelerate here. It's not, there we go. Okay. So if we look at how we've progressed on the Sustainable Development Goals, as I said, the record is not very good. Only on a few of the targets, the many 162 or some targets, have we actually been on track to achieving them by 2030. Most other cases, we're going too slow. In some cases, we're actually going in the wrong direction. For example, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at a slower pace, yes, and they would be rising much faster if governments weren't doing something. But we can't just have slower rising greenhouse gas emissions. We have to have declining greenhouse gas emissions before long if we're going to address that problem. Other areas where there have been some improvements, reductions in child mortality, HIV infections have also been significantly reduced, and I'll mention that in a moment. Improvements in access to water, sanitation, and even energy. Energy access has improved tremendously. In India, for example, where much of rural India was unelectrified until fairly recently, there's been massive electrification going on. Africa, of course, is the next wave, if you will, still very unelectrified. And the question will become, how do you electrify Africa? Can you do it without massive investments in coal-fired power plants or oil and gas-fired power plants? Can you do it with renewable energy or other clean sources of energy? There aren't many other clean ones. I know nuclear is one in Korea that's used very widely. And maybe one of the reasons why Korea has a very low penetration of renewable energy, because it relies, it's sort of like France. France relies heavily on nuclear, so it's not creating greenhouse gases. We don't need to worry. But of course, other countries don't have that option really and have to think about how to increase renewable investments. So I'll skip this slide just to show you that renewables are achieving rapid increase in the world because of the declining costs of renewable energy, solar and wind. And why has the cost declined so dramatically? Because government policy has induced the scaling up of the deployment of renewable energy. German feed-in tariffs, Spain's feed-in tariffs, China's also got massive investments in renewable energy. India also now in renewable energy. So as the production of the technologies grows, as solar panels, wind turbines, the costs decline, and they decline very steeply. And as they become cheaper, more and more countries and people can afford them, and they diffuse more rapidly. And so that is what is happening right now. We're in a period of rapid diffusion of these technologies. So there is some cause for optimism. But even with the rates of diffusion at the moment, the starting point was so small. Renewables was such a small share of global energy supply that you can double and triple and quadruple for years, and you're still only making a dent in the surface of the problem. That's the challenge. So, okay. So just to say one last thing about the energy transition challenge. In the past, the transitions from coal to oil and gas have been more or less driven by market forces. Coal is polluting, so you don't want to have to depend on it if you don't have to. Oil and gas became much cheaper, and so there was an incentive to substitute towards those fuels. But it was not driven by government policy so much, because all of them are polluting, so governments didn't really care whether you use coal or oil or gas. It was really the market which determined. Whereas in this case, this transition, governments do care because they're not all the same. Fossil fuels are not the same as renewable energy in terms of their impacts on the global climate system. And so government policy is trying to accelerate that transition. And that's what I want to say a bit about in my final remarks. So how do you achieve acceleration? Well, you know, it's a tricky situation because acceleration is a two-edged sword. I mean, autocrats can achieve acceleration by absolute power. Okay. So I've exceeded my time, or almost exceeded my time. Okay. So does everybody want an autocracy to guide the transition to renewable energy and sustainable development? I don't think so, you know. Democracies like their democratic institutions. How do you achieve this acceleration if you're not going to have autocrats basically directing everything that happens in your country? And this is a huge challenge for the transition. And two examples illustrate this. In France, a few years back, you may remember 2018, the president, and in France, the president is a very powerful president. He's not an autocrat, he's democratically elected, but he's almost like an autocrat because his term is so long and he has such powers. and he introduced a fuel tax on diesel fuel, which is mostly what's used in taxis and other things in France, based on carbon content. And there was an uprising, people in the streets. Of course, people love to protest in the streets in France. So it's not that uncommon, but still, it was very, very unpopular. You had the yellow vests, as they were called, the gilets jaunes, who were basically causing major economic disruptions. And the government had to back down, basically rescind the tax. So what was the point? I mean, you created massive social unrest, unpopularity, and you achieved nothing, right? So Germany, on the other hand, has a very different approach. A consensus, at least it used to. I don't know anymore if it still can follow that model. but using consensus building through tripartite consultations with government, business, and trade unions and broader society to agree on what needs to be done and how fast we can do it and who's going to be affected and how we're going to protect those who are vulnerable. For example, workers in the coal mining industry in East Germany who are going to be laid off. Okay? You got to do something about it. You can't just say, oh, sorry, we decided to get out of coal, you're out of a job, tough luck. No. So that consensus building approach, of course, is the way that you can achieve sustainable progress that's not reversed overnight, but it takes time to build consensus. You don't just build consensus at the drop of a hat. So the contradiction is you need to make progress with haste. How do you make progress with haste when it takes time to build the consensus you need to make progress? So this is the dilemma that we all face. I mean, all of us. It's not just, and in Korea, the same thing. Some industries in Korea are going to be affected by the transition. The government has to think about how that's going to affect communities, people, and what it needs to do to ensure that they aren't going to go out in the streets and undermine its efforts, but are going to be supportive because they see that either they're going to be taken care of through retraining and redeployment, or they're going to be given social protection, an early pension or whatever it might be if they're older workers, okay? You have to think about these things. This is the reality. Okay. So I think I better stop. I think I've exceeded my time. So I will stop here. I'll come back to other things later. Let me just, you can look at my slides at your leisure. But I didn't get the right version of the PowerPoint, so I don't have my last slide. But my last slide was to set the stage for a discussion in the panel of post-2030. What comes after, and I have my slide. Let me just look at it quickly and refer to it because I can't see it on the screen. What comes after the 2030 agenda? Okay. Because we're getting not that far off from 2030. We're in 2024, right? Okay. Almost 2025. So let me just wrap it up by saying, okay, maybe I should shut up. That even if we accelerate progress on many of the goals, and I really hope we accelerate progress on climate change, even if nothing else, that would be very helpful. It seems very unlikely that we're going to meet many of the goals by 2030. They're just too far off, and we have so little time. I mean, even the most rapid acceleration, maybe we would achieve some of them, but probably not all or even most. Okay, that's the reality. We have to face it. So what do? What comes next then? Okay, do we just throw up our hands and say, okay, that was a failure. We're not going to bother anymore. Well, I think everybody agrees that the SDGs remain worthy objectives. I don't think anybody has said these are garbage and we should just throw them out, and start from scratch. So, okay, they may be too ambitious, unrealistic, idealistic, if you will. So what we need in the first instance, in the lead up to 2030, is a frank, objective assessment of the progress we've made, the reasons that we've fallen short, what are the shortcomings of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda that we should have anticipated, but maybe some things we didn't see coming down the road, okay? Like the pandemic, for example, okay. But does falling short undermine their legitimacy? Does it undermine the resolve of actors, governments, business, society to achieve them? Or are they still essentially valid and worthy of pursuit? And if they are valid and worthy of pursuit, then how do they evolve into a post-2030 agenda? What does that look like? And how do we take into account some of the things that maybe weren't prominent yet in 2015 or 2013, 14 when we renegotiate them, but now have become more prominent in international discussions and need to be addressed going forward because this, we're looking at 2030 to 2045 now, so, or beyond 2050 if you talk about the framework for, a net zero transition in the case of climate. So what should that agenda look like? That's different from the SDGs, I guess, and the 2030 agenda. And there's artificial intelligence, which is now the latest rage and buzzword. Okay, is that going to change things in a fundamental way? Artificial life, all of these things, existential threats to humanity beyond climate change. Okay, international migration induced by climate change, conflicts, and these are all growing problems, growing challenges, growing risks that maybe didn't figure as prominently and weren't addressed as coherently as they should have been, as holistically in the 2030 agenda. But now we've got to take them on, and we've got to figure out what the international agenda looks like going forward. Okay, I'll leave it there. Sorry for taking too long.
Do have a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to use it because I don't like PowerPoint. Before I came, I didn't know whether the audience, the students, would like to have PowerPoint or not. So I prepared with the help of the colleague in KEI, just in case. But the more I look at the PowerPoint, the more I don't like it. Until 2 years ago, I worked at the United Nations Environment Program based in Geneva. In Geneva, UNEP, of course, the headquarters is located in Nairobi, Kenya. In Geneva, there is an office deals with the relationships between the environment and trade and economics. So I was there in the Geneva office. 2 years ago, I retired. Before I retired, I led UNEP Green Economy Initiative, and I have been asked to introduce the Green Economy Initiative to this audience today. Let's start by asking you, how many of you have heard the term green economy or green growth? Let's have a show of hands. Yeah? Okay, maybe a quarter or maybe 1/5. Let's go back in time to 2008, 2009. I suppose some of you might have been in kindergarten or primary school. There was something big happening in the world. There were some big financial houses on the Wall Street went bankrupt, and the effects were transmitted throughout the world through the banking system. Yeah? So it was known as the global financial and economic crisis. Lots of countries were in economic difficulties, big time. I was in UNEP, and UNEP at the time, we launched a global initiative. It's called Global Green New Deal. Some of you who have studied history, especially the American history, you might recall in the 1929, 1930s, there was a Great Depression. Yeah? And the President Roosevelt came up with the idea of New Deal, where the US federal government intervened in the market with major investments in the US infrastructure systems, including big highways, railways, job creation schemes, and so on. So it was known as the New Deal, meaning a deal between the government and the private sector. And that helped bring the US economy and later on, maybe the global economy, slowly they got out of the recession, slowly recovering their economies. Now, in 2008, when UNEP launched the Global Green New Deal, the idea was to encourage governments around the world to use their fiscal policies, to use fiscal stimulus, fiscal spending, to invest in major environmental projects as a way to grow out of recession, to also at the same time to build a strong environmental basis, because the idea was to invest in, for example, land restoration, to invest in renewable energies, to invest in waste collection systems, and so on, because these projects, they could help create jobs. They could also at the same time improve the environment. This idea of a global Green New Deal actually came from a study that was published by a global environmental group known as the Greenpeace. Yeah, you might have heard the Greenpeace, who are known for their very strong actions to protect the environment. The Greenpeace in the United Kingdom, it was commissioned a report by the British government at that time, and the report was entitled A Green New Deal for the UK, where the Greenpeace recommended to the British government to also use fiscal stimulus, fiscal spending, and invest in the environmental sectors as a way for the UK to grow out of the crisis and also to improve the environment in the United Kingdom. So UNEP, we picked the idea and we wanted to scale it up globally. And at that time, it was not only UNEP, but also for the UN system overall, under the leadership of the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The UN system overall and the Ban Ki-moon himself was promoting globally the idea of a global Green New Deal. In response, a number of countries, they did allocate big amounts of their fiscal resources, government spending, to invest in the environmental sectors, including in South Korea. At that time, South Korea was among some of the countries that allocated a significant proportion of their fiscal spending to the environmental sectors. I think including some works on the water management in the Hangang region. And there were other G20 countries. They allocated significant amounts of funds to start developing the renewable energy systems. So that was a short-term response to the global financial and economic crisis. It was a short-term response. Now, let's move on to the green economy. The green economy, it came from the idea of a Green New Deal, of a global Green New Deal. Let me perhaps going back to what David was talking about on sustainable development. The idea of sustainable development was initially established or formalized in 1992 at the first Rio Summit. That's where the definition of sustainable development was established, was officialized, was accepted by governments. However, until now, as you heard from David, the progress on sustainable development has been disappointing, even in the context of the 2030 agenda or in the context of the SDGs. Yeah? We are not really on track if you are looking at the indicators, the targets. We are not. So the question is, why is that? Why the idea of sustainable development was established more than how many decades ago? 1992 until now, how many years? 32 years. Yeah. So how many, well, a very long time has passed since the idea first came up, and still we are not doing very well. So I would ask the question, why is that? Around 2008, 2009, while we were working on the Global Green New Deal, we tried to dig deeper into this question, why we are not doing well on sustainable development. And we came up with one observation, one conclusion, if you will. And the conclusion is that for many, many years, we see environment and the economy as rivalries. In other words, we see that there are strong trade-offs between the environment and the economy. Okay? For many countries, their first priority is to develop, is to make more money, to increase income, right? You can also say to reduce poverty. And the environment is a luxury, or spending on the environment is not a top priority. Okay? So there is still a very strong tendency for many countries to develop first and take care of the environment later on. Until now, still, right? In research, and you are in a research institution here, in a lot of research publications, literatures, doctor thesis, papers, books, and so on, when researchers dealt with the relationship between the environment and the economy, certainly until 2008, until 2009, because I did the literature review until then, I found that most of the literature on the environment and the economy tended to focus on negative relationships between the two. In other words, one would observe that economic growth destroys the environment, depletes natural resources, generates lots of waste, generates pollution. So that is a negative relationship, a negative impacts of economic activities in the environment. From the other side, environmental degradation, resource depletion, further undermines the basis for economic development, for economic growth. So again, you see the negative narrative, a negative articulation, a negative framing of the relationships between the economy and the environment. And that kind of narrative, the negative narrative, is not very inspiring for policymakers, right? Because you keep hearing this negative narrative. It does not motivate policymakers to take actions because you get the negative messages the whole time. So when I was working in UNEP, when we were trying to change the narrative, to change the discourse, we made a deliberate effort to emphasize the positive relationships, to flip the narrative, to change the narrative in such a way to say, look, to say to the finance minister, to say, look, if you invest in environmental sectors, if you invest in renewable energy, clean technology, green buildings, sustainable tourism, sustainable logging, fisheries, organic agriculture, if you invest in these green activities, you could also generate income. You could also create new jobs. And on top of it, you can improve the environment. We wanted to change the discourse in order to motivate policymakers to take actions. Because this positive narrative, this positive framing of the relationship between the economy and the environment may have a chance to make a difference. Okay? But as researchers, we know we need to be able to substantiate this claim, right? We cannot just say, look, there are positive relationships between environment and economy. We need to show evidence. We need to prove the positive relationship through analytics, through quantitative analysis, and so on. So in UNEP, we mobilized several hundred contributors globally from developed countries, developing countries, to get into a major piece of study on green economy. We also engaged several thousand reviewers of the study. But the central piece of it is that we used a system dynamics modeling tool to do a scenario analysis. We say, look, if the world as a whole is prepared to invest between 1 to 2% of the global GDP, 1 to 2% of the global GDP over 40 years, from 2010 to 2050, if we spent that amount of money globally in renewable energy, clean technologies, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry and fisheries, sustainable tourism, energy efficiency, and sustainable cities, sustainable buildings, and so on, green buildings, what would happen to the global GDP, to jobs, to carbon emissions, to biodiversity? We did that. We engaged a professional modeling group to do that analysis, and we got the results. The results show that if the world is willing to do that in the medium and the long term, we would see higher income levels, more jobs compared to the situation where we spend the same amount in the business as usual scenario in the way we have been doing investments. So that findings were quite important in motivating governments to such an extent that they put green economy as one of the 2 agenda items at Rio +20 in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, 20 years after the first Rio, there was a gathering again in Rio de Janeiro, and there were initially 2 agenda items, and one of which is green economy in the context of sustainable development and the poverty eradication, and the outcome document from Rio +20, the future we want, agreed that green economy is an important tool for achieving sustainable development and the poverty eradication. So the point here is that through this change of narrative from a negative framing of the relationship between the economy and the environment to a positive framing of the relationship, it has managed to change the discourse at the international level. UNEP, of course, is one of the organizations at the time to promote this idea of green economy. Okay? At the same time, other major international organizations, such as the World Bank, such as the OECD, they have all got very interested in promoting similar ideas, and oftentimes they use a somewhat different terminology like green growth. And the same thing for the Republic of Korea. They have used the concept of green growth, but in essence, green growth and the green economy, they are very similar. I used to describe the two as twins, with the same, well, in East Asia at least, we put our last name first, right? Both have the same last name, Green, and then one's first name is called growth, the other one is economy. So you pretty much, you can consider them to be the same. Now, with this change of discourse, with the adoption of green economy as a major instrument for delivering sustainable development, there have been major international support for advancing this agenda. For example, under the leadership of the Republic of Korea, there is an international intergovernmental organization created and based in Seoul, in Korea. It's called Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute, which is an intergovernmental body mobilizing resources to help developing countries to implement this green economy, green growth agenda, to really realize the potential of these positive relationships between the economy and the environment. There have also been other international mechanisms to support developing countries to implement the green economy. Another example is there are 5 United Nations organizations. They have got together and created a joint funding mechanism. It's called the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, PAGE. It involves the following United Nations organizations. UNEP, of course, UNEP initiated this mechanism, but also UNDP, UN Development Program, UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization based in Vienna, and the International Labour Organization, as well as a smaller UN entity. It's called UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITA. Okay? These 5 UN organizations, they got together, they got the funding from major donors, in particular from UNEP, to provide intellectual strategic support to countries interested in developing green economy strategies, to implement action plans, to build capacities, and to mobilize finance for green investments. So these are some of the impacts, if you will, that have been created with the Green Economy Initiative that was launched around 2008 and 2009. Okay. Moving forward, I think we may want to still consider green economy as a major instrument for delivering the SDGs, for delivering sustainable development, even beyond 2030. Why? Because a lot of the SDG goals and targets, they are interconnected. Okay? And if we can focus the green economy, green growth instrument on the idea, the central idea of investment, then perhaps we can make some progress. Why? Because if you think about it, to achieve any or all of the SDGs, the goals and targets, you need money. You need to spend. You need to spend on food security. You need to spend on health. You need to spend on reducing the gap between the rich and the poor. You need to spend on improving the environment. You need to spend on reducing carbon emissions. You need to make investments. If we do not have a strong role for the investment, then we're probably not getting anywhere or not getting very far. So at the end of the day, and I'll conclude here, if we want to move forward, we need to focus more and more and more on the role of investment. The investment not only from the government, but also from the private sector, and maybe jointly as well. Not only from domestic financial resources, but also from international financial resources. Only when we are able to change the investment flow, only if we are able to generate new investments, new funding, then we'll be able to achieve some of the SDG goals. Okay. I will stop here and I will welcome any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
All right, so while you guys reorganize your thoughts and come up with questions to ask our speaker, as the privilege of the moderator, let me ask a question first to both of you. So based on your extensive experience working for an international organization, sounds like you probably faced a lot of frustration. And so as a researcher and as a mentor to many students who hope to contribute to this discussion, how did you remain sane? How were you able to stay optimistic for all the years that you have spent discussing this agenda that seemed to be stagnant and hard to move forward?
Am I sane? You want to go first? Well, I can't pretend it was easy. As you've, let's see. Is it working?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, boy. I guess the worst moment of the whole process was on the day it was after several sleepless nights where I was responsible for preparing the final text for adoption of the SDGs by the Open Working Group. And so the co-chairs, who were the ambassadors of Kenya and Hungary at the time, the co-chairs of the Open Working Group, they got the final draft of the goals. They were involved, obviously, in dealing with some of the complex political negotiations involving the United States and the Chinese and the G77 and the Europeans, etc. And there were also some other issues that had to be resolved that are of a more political nature, but always intervene in UN negotiations, for example, to do with Palestine and occupied territories. So we came up with this final version. It was cleared by the co-chairs to be reproduced in 193 or more copies to be circulated to the member states about, 10 o'clock in the morning. This was, as I said, after 3 nights without sleep. And then they had to read it, still, and provide their comments and whether they were going to adopt it or not. So they went away, and there were a lot of backroom discussions in the groups, the G77 and some of the others, the European Union and so on. And then after about 2 hours, now it's noontime on a Saturday now we're talking about, the co-chairs reconvene the meeting and they say, okay, let me hear from you all. Is this acceptable? And I was sitting up on the podium with the co-chairs and my boss, the head of the Division for Sustainable Development, and the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, and others, all sort of tensely waiting for what was going to happen, right? And so the first to speak, I think, was Nigeria or some country like that, who was extremely critical, to say the least, of some elements. Not the whole thing, but some elements that they didn't like, okay? And so Nigeria speaks, and we're off to a bad start. So I'm beginning to get depressed. And then I think they call Iran or something, and even worse. So then I'm really getting depressed, and I'm sitting there, and my head is now bowed, and I'm thinking, my God, I spent all these years of my life trying to achieve agreement on these goals, and now they're going to go down in flames in a matter of an hour or so. And then another 1 or 2 countries, similarly, maybe not as negative as those two, but equally, also very, very critical of the text. And then I guess at some point, after several critical comments, and I was really feeling that this is a lost cause, the co-chair ambassador of Kenya, who was managing, it's like stage managing, he's stage managing the negotiations and the comments, okay? And he had in his head, which I think you'll read in the book that was advertised shamelessly on the screen earlier, if you want to read it, he says, at least, that he had in his head how to orchestrate this in a way that would lead to what he hoped would be a successful outcome. All of us hoped would be a successful outcome. So at some point, he then calls upon the groups, beginning with the G77. And this is the G77. You know what it is, all of you, right? You know? Everybody knows what the G77 is? Okay. And so I think it was, I forget who was the ambassador of the G77 at that time. Maybe it was Fiji, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, so everyone is waiting with bated breath because everyone knows that if the G77 trashes it, it's finished. Regardless of what individual countries say, what really matters is that the developing country bloc, if you will, has to weigh in. And if they support it, then everyone breathes a collective sigh of relief. And so, sure enough, the G77 spokesperson, ambassador, spoke up and said, well, we have our, we're not happy with everything here. Of course, nobody is happy with everything, but nobody can expect to be happy with everything. This is going to be a consensus document that has to be accepted by 193 countries of very, very different points of view on the world and different levels of development and so on. But it's good enough for us. We accept this, and we're ready to gavel it through to go to the General Assembly for adoption. And so everyone breathes a sigh of relief. And then, of course, what comes next is, what does the United States have to say about it? Because that's the next big elephant in the room, right? And so then the ambassador of the United States, she's now the head of USAID, Samantha Power. She's a big, big name in the humanitarian community. She was a journalist in some of the hot spots of the world, Bosnia, and wrote books about it and so on. But then she was the U.S. ambassador at the time of Obama. And so she comes and she says, yeah, we also have our issues with it. There's some things we don't like because they didn't get all the things they wanted. They didn't want inequalities in there and a whole bunch of other stuff. Mention of common but differentiated responsibilities. But it's good enough for us, and we endorse it for forwarding to the General Assembly. And then, of course, the last piece is the European Union, because that represents another big power bloc. And the same thing. We don't like everything here. These are the things, and the Europeans, of course, say not enough on human rights and on governance and so on. But it's good enough for us. And so at that point, it was becoming clear that it had passed the threshold of critical mass of important countries who were going to endorse this. And so, I kind of lifted my head like, oh my God, it's actually going to pass. And then, he decided that there were still 20, this was already now 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the afternoon on the Saturday. And he decided, okay, we have 20 more countries who want to speak, okay? But we know where this is going, and we don't want to spend the whole afternoon here listening to countries speaking. So I'm just going to put this out and say, if I don't hear any objections, I bang the gavel, and it's agreed by consensus, and it goes to the General Assembly. And so he did that, and everybody in the room broke out in raucous cheering and laughter and clapping, and it was sort of the best moment of my life, you could say, except for my daughter's birth, of course, but that's another matter. So anyway, that's the kind of up and down that one has to be willing and able to deal with. Even makes me cry now. But anyway, and I'm sure Fulai has had moments like that as well. But anyway, I'll stop there just to give you an indication. You have to have tough skin, but you also have to have a big heart to be able to to cope with these kinds of situations. Basically, it's not easy, but at the end of the day, we have it, and we have to work with it, and we have to try to make it succeed. Try to achieve these goals. And what's extraordinary to me is that that soon after that, the first Trump term started. It was right after the 2030 agenda was adopted, the SDGs. Trump came into office, right? He got out of the Paris Agreement immediately, right? But he didn't get out of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. He never mentioned them because he probably didn't know about them. Nobody put it on his desk and said, shh, don't tell him. But anyway, let's see what happens in the second term, but let's hope that they continue to make progress. Okay, Fulai, yeah.
First of all, being pessimistic. Being pessimistic because for those of us who have lived through many years of work trying to solve those problems, sustainability problems, environmental crisis, climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, plastics, and so on, there is not very much improvement on the ground. Okay. Even today, 4 or 5 years after the launch of the SDGs, we are still not on track on many of the indicators. That's why one tends to be pessimistic. Right? How can one not be pessimistic if you see the same old problems you experienced 30 years ago and they still exist, and some of the problems even get exacerbated? And a lot of people say achieving 1.5 degree is a dream. It's not possible. Even 2 degree is hardly likely. A lot of the coastal areas are likely to be inundated. So, first of all, being pessimistic is probably not unusual. Number one. Number two, being pessimistic not only because of the problems that still exist, but because the world, including the United Nations, have tended to spend a lot of efforts, a lot of time, a lot of energy, including the ones described by David, several nights, sleepless nights, negotiating punctuations, commas, full stops, exclamation marks, quotation marks, and so on. I mean, of course, the language as well. Spending so much effort on negotiations, on negotiating big documents. And the implementation of these agreements is quite another story. Right? So on the one hand, you involve so many countries in so many gatherings, not only the UN summits, but also all these COPs, no? The CBD COP, the climate COPs, and so on. And eventually, you may be able to manage to get those gatherings to adopt certain documents. But putting these commitments into action is a totally different story. And that's why we are seeing the SDGs not on track. So that's another reason for being pessimistic. Yeah. Thirdly, being optimistic. The question is, what's the use of it, being pessimistic, right? There is no use, because being pessimistic doesn't solve any problem. You can keep complaining, you can keep being depressed, you can keep being anxious, but doesn't help anything, it doesn't solve any problem. So in that sense, one has to be optimistic. Why? Because being optimistic at least encourages us to seek solutions, compared to being pessimistic, because it's not useful. So in that sense, being optimistic is useful. At least it motivates us to try to find the solutions, even though it may not be very easy. And fourthly, a major solution, based on what I presented earlier, a major solution is or has to do with investment. To me, that holds everything together. Right? And that's why also a lot of the problems with implementing global agreements has to do first and foremost with financing. Okay? In almost all these gatherings, developing countries, there are always three things they emphasize in order for them to be able to implement any commitments. First and foremost is financing. They would like the developed world, developed countries to commit funds to help developing countries to take those actions, right? And oftentimes, it's on the issue of financing that countries find it difficult to come together. Okay. Second thing developing countries always ask for is technology transfer. But we know technology doesn't come without a price tag, right? Not only when you have to transfer technology, but also when you have to use the technology to implement the technology, it involves costs, right? And thirdly, capacity building. Almost always asking for more capacity. But capacity building also comes with a price tag. When you bring people to a training workshop, you have to cover their travel costs. You have to cover their meals and everything, right? And you cannot do capacity building like, just a one-off event. You have to do it systematically. You have to train the key players on a regular basis. And this is something I believe maybe the Seoul National University, including your graduate school, perhaps is something that you have been doing, but it has to be done on a regular basis and doesn't come without a price tag. Someone has to pay for it. And that's why my conclusion or something for you to take away, my message for you to take away is investment, investment, investment. That's it. Thank you.
So I'm sure we have questions and comments from the floor. So if you want to speak up, please.
Thank you so much for insightful and compelling presentations by two speakers today. My name is Semee Yoon, who studied public administration in Global. And I have questions. I have one question for each speaker. First one is to the former head of UNEP. Because I remember your speech vividly. Given nations' physical constraints, how can financing models like, as I check, green bonds are very effective, but I would like to listen to your opinion about this. Green bonds or climate risk insurance ensure inclusivity for vulnerable nations, and what key steps are needed to mobilize these two resources while preserving national sovereignty? This is my first question. And the second one is raised to the representative of IUCN. As I check, your organization is the oldest global environment organization. I also like to listen to your opinion in terms of international collaboration. As I reviewed the World Social Report recently, UNEP and IUCN's collaboration in areas such as, I can see, nature-based resolution called NES for climate adaptation and the global biodiversity framework stood out. So I think in today's global crisis, I think the UN's role as a coordinating body is crucial. How can UNEP and IUCN enhance their collaboration with other UN agencies to better align efforts with the 2030 SDGs addressing both immediate crisis and long-term sustainability. I need your opinion. Thank you.
These are great questions. Let's gather like 2 more questions and maybe we can answer them simultaneously. Are there other comments or questions?
Thank you. My name is Cynthia Amason from Ghana and a DCPP student. So I would want to also find, I would like to know your thoughts on South-South cooperation in terms of an investment pool for developing countries to accelerate the implementation of their SDGs. So I would like to know how we can enhance our South-South cooperation as an investment pool for implementation of SDGs. Thank you.
So DCPP is our sharing program that we offer to common officials from developing countries, supported by COIC. There may be one more question.
Thank you for the wonderful lectures today. I really enjoyed your lecture. And my question is to Mr. Sheng. You said economic growth and green economy and green growth are twins, right? And it's been like almost 20 years since their birth in 2008, right? So since their birth, I believe that the situation and whole environment is changing a lot, especially with the re-election of Mr. Trump. Do you think our twins are strong enough to survive? Or is there any siblings of these twins that can cope with this challenging, divided world? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, next round.
Thank you. 감사합니다. The first question on the financing, yeah, and as you said rightly, that many countries are fiscally constrained. That's a terminology, but basically it means governments, they don't have a lot of money. But the reality is governments, they do spend money on a day-to-day basis. The question is, what do they spend on, right? In some countries, you know, they spend on the military. You know which countries are spending heavily on military. In some countries, they spend heavily on the salaries of civil servants with a big bureaucracy. There are countries where governments spend a lot of money subsidizing the use of fossil fuels. Yeah? So the first point on financing is we can take a look at how governments are spending money right now and whether there is a room for adjusting the existing spending patterns in order to spend money where societal needs are strongest, okay? Where society, the needs are most urgent. So the first one is really how do we reallocate government spending, number one. Number two is, yes, even with that, government's financial resource, fiscal resources are still maybe relatively limited. So many countries are now getting interested in something called sustainable financing or green financing. And under green financing, you have different practices, right? For example, banks maybe give credits, give loans to environmental projects or to renewable projects with low interest rates, with a long maturity dates. In other cases, there is also an issuance of green bonds, 20 years, 30 years. And green bonds basically issuing green bonds is a way to raise capital from the capital markets, from individual subscribers of the bonds, in order to use the money raised through the bonds to invest in environmental projects. But of course, those bonds need to pay out interests at the end of the day, right? Together with the principals of the bonds over a long time. So these green bonds will need to be able to spend on projects that generate financial returns, right? So if you use the green bonds, the proceeds from the green bonds in renewable energy, you would expect those projects to generate financial returns and to be able to pay the bondholders at the end of the day with an interest. So those bonds come with a condition of where you want to spend the proceeds. There is a lot of effort going on globally and also in the Asia-Pacific region on green finance, sustainable finance, including in South Korea. Yesterday, there was a meeting where we saw the chief of the Korean Financial Regulatory Commission. He himself, on behalf of South Korea, is represented in the G20 working group on sustainable finance. So there is a global effort to encourage the financial systems to direct their capital towards green projects. That's my second point in response to the question on financing. And finally, you made a reference perhaps to some island countries, small island countries, and something about insurance against, perhaps, if I understand it correctly, the insurance against risks, climate risks, for example, right? When small countries face extreme weather conditions, hurricanes and floods, and and obviously those extreme events are likely to cause economic losses, and how these losses can be insured. In this regard, in the global and the regional initiative on green sustainable finance, there is also a major role for insurance companies to participate in green finance, to provide insurance to these risks and so on. But I think a very important part of it is that businesses operating in those places, investors operating in those locations, they need to take into account how those extreme weather conditions are likely to affect their businesses. Okay, how the risks are likely to impact their financial returns. And for that matter, these businesses, they would have to buy insurance against those risks and so on. So I think this is one way of dealing with those risks. And there is a lot of interest, by the way, in green finance, sustainable finance, following the Green Economy Initiative. The Green Economy Initiative was launched in 2008 and so on, when we were able to mobilize the international community to start looking into green investments and so on. And then after that, there is a growing interest in green finance in order to provide the financing necessary to implement the green economy. Now, on the question of South-South collaboration, I think there are existing mechanisms to do that, including, even though South Korea is not really part of the South, but still it provides support to developing countries to build their capacity, perhaps even to make investments in some cases in developing countries. And hopefully these investments will meet sustainability criteria. But there are other countries in the region, in other parts of the world, that make major investments in Africa, right, in developing countries. And from what I know, more and more such investments in infrastructure, in buildings, airports, transport systems, agriculture, and so on, more and more these investments are being scrutinized by NGOs, by international community, to see whether they meet sustainability criteria. So I think there is a positive development to be optimistic about making sure that investments in South-South cooperation context are likely to move towards the green economy direction. And finally, the green growth and the green economy twins. I think the twins are still growing, and they are still vibrant, still dynamic. U.S. is one of the players, but it is not the only player. And there are so many other countries who are now enthusiastic about the green economy. And the major signals for being optimistic about the twins is, from what we have observed, the narrative in the climate discussion has become more positive. In other words, climate actions are no longer regarded as a cost item only. More and more countries are seeing the benefits from taking climate actions. There are economic benefits from taking climate actions. So this is a positive development. But also, I think the operations of major international institutions like the GGGI that I mentioned. Recently, I checked on the website of the GGGI. They have a very higher leverage ratio. In other words, $1 spent or invested by GGGI can leverage, I think, close to $20, which is extremely high, and I couldn't believe it in the first instance. They have a targets of using their investments, which are small, and usually they are grant money, to generate investments by investors, the real money to do real projects. So there are reasons to be optimistic about the space for the twins to grow before they have offsprings. They are not coming to the marriage age yet. Thank you.
Just a quick point about IUCN. First of all, I no longer work with IUCN, so this is not quite correct. But I was the permanent observer of IUCN at the United Nations for several years after I left the United Nations. And I was there during the time when the Global Biodiversity Framework was under negotiation, but also another very important accomplishment at that time was the agreement under the, I guess it was under the General Assembly, of a new treaty on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is the high seas. I don't know if you know, the high seas means the oceans beyond national territory, beyond exclusive economic zones, basically where nobody has any jurisdictional rights. And for that reason, there's no property rights, then it's subject to the commons problem. Overfishing, overexploitation, it's essentially a Wild West in some regards, you could say. And so how do you govern the biodiversity, the environmental resources in the deep sea, in the oceans? And so the international community, actually one of the accomplishments of Rio Plus 20 was calling for negotiations on such a treaty, and the treaty was eventually agreed, although it has not yet been ratified, because ratification takes a certain number of countries, and I think it's something like 60 or 70 that need to ratify before it goes into effect, and that hasn't happened yet. The risk is that it won't happen, and the treaty for all the negotiations will end up never being implemented, which would be a shame because there is a rich biodiversity on this earth, since the oceans make up most of the surface of the earth, and there is rich biodiversity there which will potentially be lost, and that includes valuable species that could provide cures for cancer or for disease or be sources of food or sources of any number of benefits to humanity, apart from their, being part of biodiversity as such. So I was there for that. But one of the biggest accomplishments, I guess, that where IUCN inputted into the process was the Global Biodiversity Framework. And IUCN is a unique organization in that it's a cross between governmental and non-governmental organization. It has NGOs who are members of its governing body. It has governments who are members of its governing body. And it also has now indigenous peoples organizations who are part of its governing body. And the decisions taken in IUCN's Congress, it's every 4 years, I think, are done through this bicameral governing body where NGOs vote in one chamber, governments vote in another chamber, and then there's a formula which is used to decide whether a resolution passes depending on the votes in those two chambers, a majority in the two chambers. I don't know what the exact majority has to be, but in any case, that's the way it works. But it is essentially, at the end of the day, a massive scientific organization, because the people who do all the work at IUCN are scientists around the world, in the natural sciences, in the social sciences, but mostly in the biological and natural sciences, who are members of different species working groups, studying the behavior and the survival risks of different species, covering the whole spectrum of animal and plant life, basically. So there are vast resources, intellectual resources that IUCN commands, and those resources were brought to bear to inform, for example, the targets that went into the Global Biodiversity Framework, the 30 by 30 targets. Why did the world community come up with this 30 by 30? It wasn't just a random number. Just as 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees are not just random numbers that were pulled out of a hat, they may not be the most scientifically rigorous because, there has to be political acceptance too, and so, scientists may want one thing and politicians another, so there has to be some give and take there. But 30 by 30 was sort of the minimum that scientists could agree and politicians could agree, the area of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems which needed to be protected and restored by 2030 in order to ensure healthy biodiversity, environments for biodiversity to thrive for the rest of this century and for the rest of the centuries to come, basically, because, we aren't going to be alive very long, but presumably humanity will still be around if we don't destroy ourselves in another 100, 200 years. What will biodiversity look like by then? Well, there'll be a lot of engineered species, no doubt. We don't know. I mean, this is one of the most exciting and unknown areas of life sciences, is what human life, what natural life, what artificial life will look like, and how these things will interact in the future. But we do know that, well, okay, I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say one thing about the climate risk insurance, just so in case you aren't aware. There are existing facilities. There's one that seems to have functioned quite well in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is a region very heavily exposed to weather-related risks. And it's hard to insure climate risk because it's been very hard to attribute events, weather events, to climate. That attribution science is developing. and it's now becoming quite sophisticated. So it is possible to say that this natural disaster, this hurricane, or this drought was with high probability caused by climate change. Because without climate change, there would have been a 1 in a million chance of this happening. But this happened, and the probability of its happening was much higher with climate change. Okay, and so you can make an attribution. But for insurance purposes, of course, where you're dealing with real money, you have to, have a firmer link to the actual event. And the way in which that's dealt with in the Caribbean is through essentially weather-related insurance, extreme weather insurance, if you will, catastrophic risk insurance it's called, where it's indexed to a measure of how severe a storm is, Category 5 hurricane, for example, or the severity of the wind, the speeds of the wind, the factors that you can actually measure with gauges and instruments, so that there's no question. And then you don't have to go out and actually look at the damage and say, okay, well, we're going to give you, how the insurance adjuster comes out and looks at your property and says, you don't get that much money. It's not that serious, No, with this kind of insurance, you say, okay, if this was the impact of this hurricane in this country, this is how much this insurance policy will pay out to you. End of story. It's an index insurance. And that has become quite an attractive way to deal with these weather-related risks, climate-related risks, if you will, with the catastrophic risk insurance in the Caribbean being an example. And of course, the fact that you're spreading the risk, the policy, if you will, over multiple countries, not all of them will be affected by the same event. So you're diversifying the risk, spreading the risk, which is what insurance is supposed to do. Because if all of the risk is concentrated, then when it happens, basically the one carrying the risk goes bankrupt, and you don't want that to happen, obviously. That's why the reinsurance industry has been so centrally involved in looking at climate risk, because the reinsurance people are the ones who insure the insurers. When the insurers go bankrupt, the reinsurers come in to cover their risk. And so they're the ones who are really worried about these catastrophic risks. And that's why they have been looking very intensely at climate change risk in particular. So it's a fascinating area. It's a very rapidly evolving area. But yes, risk insurance for climate-related risk is a very important area of study and of innovation.
Thank you both for those insightful responses to our students' questions. An important responsibility of a moderator is to end on time. So let me just wrap up. And if you have questions, you can personally reach out to them. I think hearing to both of you really reminded us of how important it is to be aware of all the international discussion that has happened so far. And I think if you have been inspired by their work so far, I think it requires for us to really spend time on not just knowing about the social science aspects of these complex challenges of sustainable development, but perhaps now that we're starting winter break, you can spend time reading about why is it that you need to know about the climate science of things or biodiversity of things to understand how are we making progress on nature-based solutions or climate insurance, etc. And yesterday I just heard from a high school teacher in Korea that they teach students about ecological transition that needs to happen when we reunify and DMZ is. And so it's really, I think there is points to stay hopeful in the sense that we have our young generation studying history and biology and even peaceful unification is all innovative. But at the same time, we have all these students showing up because their finals are over now and they don't have to be in school, but they showed up early Friday morning to hear what you had to tell us about. So I just really want to thank the audience for still keeping in mind of sustainable development at the back of your head, and I hope you can really stay encouraged and motivated by the lecture that you heard, the seminar that you heard today. Thank you.